Arguably, the most remarkable Mayan artifact ever found, the stone sarcophagus lid of King Pakal, has produced considerable controversy. Mainstream scholars believe the depiction is of King Pakal on a journey to the underworld. But ancient astronaut theorists believe the king is portrayed seated at the controls of a spacecraft and have dubbed him the Palenque astronaut.
He appears to be going into space. He's the original rocket man. There, manipulating his spacecraft, going into space.
We have maintained for a very long time that the depiction here is of King Pakal sitting in some type of a spacecraft, because he is at an angle like modern-day astronauts upon liftoff. He's manipulating some controls right here. He has some type of a breathing apparatus or some type of a telescope in front of his face. His feet are on some type of a pedal. And down here, you have something that looks like an exhaust with flames.
The sarcophagus lid of Pakal has been a centerpiece for the ancient astronaut theories since the beginning. Eric von Däniken believes this to be one of his best pieces of evidence.
And you see his upper hand, he's manipulating some controls. From the lower hand, he's turning something on. The heel of his left foot is on a kind of pedal. And outside of the capsule, you see a linking flame. This is incredible. This is absolutely a proof for extraterrestrials.
The theory rests on the idea that the Mayans were not depicting their usual symbols here, but were trying to realistically depict a rocket with Pakal as its pilot. I think the best thing I can do for you here is to clearly explain what the Mayanists and other scientists who specialize in Mayan culture and artwork believe this scene is depicting. As Ancient Alien said, archaeologists believe this scene is depicting the moment of Pakal's death and his descent into the underworld. Let me show you why they believe that. The most famous symbol in this picture is that of the world tree, which, if you believe Ancient Aliens, would make up the entire hull of the rocket. It's hard to overemphasize the importance of the world tree in Mayan mythology. The idea was that the world tree extended into the heavens with its branches, and its roots extended into the underworld. So, it was a symbol of the bridge between the underworld, heaven, and earth. When it is depicted, it almost always has the double-headed vision serpent on its branches, just like it is depicted here on Pakal's lid. The vision serpent was believed to live at the center of the world. Thus, it is depicted just above the underworld and just below the heavens. In its top branches is the celestial bird, which is seen a little more clearly in other world tree depictions like this one, but on Pakal's lid you can see it's clearly depicting the same bird. The celestial bird represented the heavens, and thus was pictured on top of the world tree. What Ancient Alien says is the exhaust or fire from the rocket's takeoff is the roots of the world tree extending into the underworld, which is not just typical for the depictions of the world tree, it's pretty much a requirement. In the underworld, we see a picture of the Mayan sun monster, which Pakal is riding into the underworld. The idea was that every time the sun set, it was actually traveling into the underworld, where it would die, like everything else in the underworld. You can even see the bottom half of the sun's face was a skeleton, while the top half still had flesh and had not yet died. This too is a common theme showing the moment of transition. So Pakal is hitching a ride on the sun into the underworld. Even the so-called smoke is easily explained when you understand Mayan symbols. In Mayan art, whenever you see a so-called traveler, which is a person in transition from one world to the next, there must be something that is making that travel possible. Sometimes it's a twisted umbilical cord, but almost always it's a serpent, often a double-headed serpent. In other words, being in the mouths of double-headed serpents was a symbol of transition from one world to the next. You can see that the so-called smoke is actually the traditional serpent's beard, which appears on almost every depiction of a serpent in Mayan art. Now that you have an idea about what the scholars believe about this, let's look at some of Ancient Alien's specific claims.
He's manipulating some controls right here.
They say his hands are manipulating some controls, but if you look closely, his right hand isn't touching anything at all, and the thing to its right is not connected to the tree any more than any of the other floating design elements in the picture. His left hand could be said to be manipulating controls more than his right, but you would have to say that all these marks on the tree are controls too, which in reality is probably the bark of the world tree, which was modeled after the ceiba tree, which had a very unique bark and thus was usually depicted in some way or another in world tree art. The odd position of Pakal's hands in this image is really what all the fuss is about. In the 1970s video refutation of the ancient astronaut theories, the Mayan expert in that film made the point that the hands in Mayan art are often depicted in delicate positions.
The Maya like to show hands in rather delicate gestures.
Such gestures are common in Mayan art. There are similar examples on the side of the slab.
As far as the claim about his foot being on a type of pedal, I would have to say that if that is how aliens design pedals, then we are far more advanced in pedal technology than they are, because that may be the worst angle to put any kind of foot pedal. Plus, there are other reliefs of Mayans in the underworld on similar slabs with their feet in similar positions, but without the rocket. Well, what about this so-called breathing tube for his nose? Well, it doesn't connect to anything, and if you look closely, the thing it could potentially connect to is also represented on the other side of the lid, and is clearly a stylistic element of the vision serpent. What it actually is a nose piercing, particularly a bone.
Here, an earring suspended from a pierced ear, a nose plug, which has the elements of death because it takes the form of a fleshless bone.
Finally, consider the context that we find this image. It's on a coffin lid, so the mainstream view is perfectly in line with that, and the whole concept was common in Mayan burials. It would have been a strange thing for them to all of a sudden abandon their usual symbolic artwork to depict a rocket on a coffin lid. The fact is that the symbols on the sarcophagus lid are really consistently used. Often the symbols are even explained in the extensive Mayan writings. These symbols fit perfectly with what we know about their beliefs about the world and the afterlife. The Nazca lines of Peru have been an important part of the ancient astronaut theory since its beginning. Originally, von Daniken claimed that the lines were kind of a UFO runway, or a type of alien airport, where the alien craft landed and took off. When challenged by Carl Sagan and others on this point in an early documentary, von Daniken kind of backtracked on this and said that he meant that the lines were created as a result of the spacecraft landing.
I never said that the extraterrestrial needed runways with concrete or something like this. My idea, which I developed in my second book and also in the book In Search of Ancient Gods, the picture book, was that some vehicle was coming down, not an interstellar spaceship, simply a small vehicle, and landing with an effect maybe even of the air cushion system. So they don't need landing tracks, but simply by the landing itself, some sand and stones are blown away, and you have a simple track on the ground. And after maybe a few hours or a few days, they start again, maybe in another direction, you have a second track, the take-off track.
In other words, he's saying that the spacecraft dragged on the surface of the ground as they landed, and that the lines are therefore the unintentional result of spacecraft landing. For the Ancient Alien series, however, it seems that they are back to claiming it was an airport.
The lines look like airstrips. They start abruptly, they end abruptly.
Looking at Nazca from the air, it looks like an airport. And it really does, because you have all these bands, wide bands that look like airstrips that are laid on top of each other, but you also have these gigantic, long, straight lines that go for miles and miles over valleys, over mountains.
Either explanation seems to fall short of explaining why these lines are sometimes several miles long, one of them being almost 15 miles long. It would be a pretty inefficient spacecraft if it took 15 miles for it to take off, or, in the alternate explanation, if it needed to drag on the ground for 15 miles before it stopped. We will look more into this later. In the meantime, I want to look at what I think may be the most ridiculous claim of the entire Ancient Alien series.
At Nazca, entire mountaintops have been removed. I mean, this all requires machining. And I'm not talking, you know, a little wheelbarrow and a pick. I'm talking sophisticated machinery, because we today would also need sophisticated machinery in order to achieve such feats.
They are claiming that this mountain in the Nazca region has been artificially sheared off. But what they are referring to is a plateau. Plateaus and mesas are naturally flat on top. They occur all over the world, and geologists know exactly how they form. In light of that, it makes them spending so much time on this point kind of funny.
There the mountain's cap comes up from both sides. Here it is flat. This is absolutely incredible. This is one of the most craziest pictures I made about Nazca.
The crazy thing is, the rubble, the remains of that summit or that mountaintop, gone. It's nowhere. It's not in the valley down below. It's nowhere in the region. What happened to it?
Okay, moving on to the lines. Nazca doesn't just have straight lines. There are also several images of animals, such as monkeys, spiders, fish, jaguars, llamas, lizards, and dogs. Contrary to what Ancient Alien says, the way that they were made is very well known. In fact, it's ridiculously simple. They simply moved the reddish-brown iron oxide-covered pebbles that cover the surface of the Nazca Desert out of the way. When the gravel is moved, the layer underneath is exposed, which is much lighter, and the contrast of the two colors creates the Nazca line. If you were in the Nazca Desert, you could create a Nazca line by running your finger over the surface of the ground. It would probably stay there for hundreds of years, too, because the Nazca Desert is one of the driest places in the world, and it almost never receives rain. If it did, the lines would have been washed away long ago because they are so superficial. Well, if these lines aren't an alien airport, what are they? What is known are the basic beliefs about religion in the ancient Nazca culture. Likely related to the arid and extreme nature of their environment, Nazca religious beliefs were centered around agriculture and fertility. Much of the Nazca art depicts powerful nature gods, such as the mythical killer whale, the harvesters, and the mythical spotted cat, etc. Essentially, they worshipped gods represented by animals, which they thought controlled things like water and crops. I might add that they were super serious about this too. So serious that they decapitated lots and lots of humans in order to appease these nature gods. I think it's fair to say that the Nazca people were obsessed with beheadings. On their pottery, it depicts crops growing from severed heads, and there are other things too that show the connections that they believed severed heads had to good crops. All that to say that these people were dead serious about farming, and if you're serious about farming, you must also be serious about water. And if you are farming in the desert, then it's off the charts how serious about water you would be. I mention this because it helps to explain what the Nazca lines likely are. First, let's take the depictions of animals. For the most part, all of these animals can also be found depicted in Nazcan pottery. They were the Nazca gods of water and fertility. If you asked an ancient Nazcan what they believed about the world and how it worked, they would likely say something like, "We take hallucinogenic drugs, we cut off a lot of heads, all in hopes that the monkey spirit will help us have some good crops this year." That just isn't what you would expect to hear if these people were smack dab in the middle of a massive mining operation conducted by UFO flying spacemen. There should be some hint of that in their mythology, if it were true. But if it is true, they apparently couldn't have cared less based on their lack of any indication in their belief system. Moving on to the actual lines. In order to understand these, we need to know a few more facts. One aspect of the Nazcan religion was huge pilgrimages. Massive amounts of Nazcans would walk to certain holy sites throughout their year. There they would participate in big religious events. The main place that they walked to was a place called Cahuachi, very near the Nazca lines. For a long time, archaeologists thought that it was the biggest Nazcan city ever found. But slowly they realized that it was never a place of permanent residence, but was only a place for all the pilgrims to converge. And what they did after they all walked there was, well, do some more walking. These walks are called processions when they are in a religious context. In the Nazcan culture, everyone got together and walked on these specific paths. The idea was that by getting everyone together and doing these rituals, they could appease these water gods. And even when the straight lines were not directly above underground water reservoirs, they were leading to mountains and other sites which were associated with the water gods, where the people would then worship those gods. So, in conclusion, the mountains weren't shaved off, the idea that it was an airport makes no logical sense, and the symbols and rituals which were a huge part of the Nazcan culture more than explain the so-called Nazca lines.
Early in the 20th century, tomb robbers searching along the Magdalena River stumbled upon a gravesite dating back 1,500 years to a pre-Columbian civilization known as the Tolima. Among the funerary objects found there were hundreds of small 2 to 3 inch gold figurines.
Many of those looked like insects and fish. However, out of those hundreds that they found, they also found about a dozen that are eerily reminiscent of modern-day fighter jets.
Okay, so he admits that when these things were found, there were hundreds of them that were clearly representing insects and animals, and only about 10 of them that looked like jet airplanes. Now, before we get into the specifics, I would like to appeal to your sense of logic. Almost all of these little figurines are depicting fish, birds, insects, lizards, and frogs. And we can see when we look at the figurines where we know what they're trying to depict, like these frogs for instance, we can see a huge amount of variation and clearly stylistic elements that are not found in nature. So we know that they weren't trying to be ultra-realistic here, which you can further see by looking at their depictions of this man, or this cat, or this alligator. The Tolima were artists, and like most artists, they had a certain style that they brought to the subjects that they were depicting. Now, considering that all the other objects they found are animals, and considering the objects in question, like all the others, have eyes and teeth and so on, isn't it more logical to assume that these objects are probably like all the others? That is, that they are also depicting some kind of animal in a stylized way? Ah, but wait, Ancient Aliens has a false dilemma for us.
And they have nothing in common with anything similar in nature.
There is not a single insect in the world which has got its wings at the bottom. Now, when you exclude the possibility that it's an insect, one of the things which remain is the fact that this is actually, yes, what it looks like, a plane.
Okay, let's see if we have this logic straight. Since no insect has these characteristics, it leaves us with only one other choice, which is an airplane. But I thought there were fish, birds, lizards, bats, and cats found too in the other 100 figurines. It would seem to me that he's kind of skipping a few options here on his way to the airplane conclusion. Let's take the most famous one, for example. This is the one that we will see later that they made a model airplane out of. The tails of all these figurines are vertical, which would make me think of fish, which also have vertical tails. One fish that the Tolima would have been familiar with is the suckermouth catfish. This might explain the round head and the big eyes, and even the small protrusions on the front of the fins. You can see that some varieties of this species of catfish have small protrusions on the front of its fins as well. When you look at the other gold figurines, you can see that not only were fish a common subject, but many different species of fish were represented. Because of the number and placement of the fins, fish are proposed for some of the other figurines as well. So when he says that no insect has its wings on the bottom, so it must be an airplane, I can only see that as deceptive, considering the placement and angle of the fins are perfectly accounted for in many fish species that were available and important to the Tolima culture. In other words, airplanes don't have a monopoly on being aerodynamic. To prove one of these figurines was aerodynamic, which according to Ancient Aliens proves it was a plane, they built a model of it. Here's what they say about it.
It was rather simple because we don't need to put much parts to this shape because this shape is perfect. Everything was already done by the native people 2,000 years ago.
they did not add an inch or remove an inch. They just essentially blew the little thing into a larger size. I mean, this is sensational.
No, they didn't add an inch or remove an inch, unless you count things like totally removing the big curls on the front of the wings, which would have rendered the model totally useless for flying. They also added curvature to the wings. They added flaps, a landing gear, and one more little thing, a propeller and an engine. Finally, I want to appeal to your sense of logic on the following point. Consider that all we know about this culture reveals them to be simple farmers, fishermen, and artisans, people that lived off the land. And considering that there is nothing in the extensive amount of archaeological material from this culture that would suggest knowledge about planes landing and taking off all the time, is it logical to assume that aliens landing and taking off in their backyards made so little impression on them that they only devote 10 of the hundreds of figurines to it, and only in one tomb? Or is it more logical to assume that just like the other hundreds of figurines with eyes and teeth and fins, that they are highly stylized animals, like fish, that they knew about and relied upon in their daily lives? I think even a die-hard ancient astronaut theorist would have to admit that logic is not on their side on this one.
Are these carvings on a wall at the Dendera Temple complex in Egypt? To some, the strange designs look eerily similar to objects very much in use today.
In Egypt, there is this underground crypt at Dendera that was always secret, and only the high priests had access to that crypt. And it's very hot in there, very narrow, low ceiling, and on the walls you have these reliefs of what looks like ancient light bulbs. Because we have to question one thing: how did the ancient Egyptians light the inside of their tombs?
The Egyptian light bulb theory. Let's see what we can figure out about it. Let's start by listening to some of the reasons that ancient astronaut theorists believe it's true.
According to most mainstream archaeologists, torches were used by the ancient Egyptians to light the pitch-black chambers of tombs and temples. Yet nowhere on the ceilings is there even the slightest evidence of soot or smoke residue.
It's hard to know why they're saying this, because there is black soot in almost every Egyptian temple and tomb. In fact, a recent ceiling cleaning conducted at the Temple of Hathor, which is the same temple where the so-called light bulb relief is found, they uncovered a brightly colored ancient ceiling painting that had never before been noticed. What was covering it up, you ask? I will quote them directly. They said that the ceiling was covered with, quote, hundreds of years of black soot. That's kind of funny, you have to admit.
Also, there isn't enough oxygen inside those tombs with which to support or feed a flame of a torch. I was once inside the king's chamber, inside the Pyramid of Giza, and somebody turned off the lights, and immediately we were in pitch darkness. And I said, no problem, I'll just take out my lighter from my satchel, and I turn on the lighter, and it didn't work.
I don't know about his specific Zippo, but there are plenty of documented explorations of the pyramid and other tombs in the early part of the 20th century which used torches to light the pyramids. Archaeologist and pyramid expert John Romer was once asked a similar question by someone on a television show. This was his response, quote, "As for the soot, there is soot in the Great Pyramid from the 19th century travelers, but most of it has been washed off. Most of the pyramids, of course, were built in sunlight, so lighting the interior would only have been a problem after the roof went on. They would have used lamps with salt in the oil so the flame burns very pure," end quote. Romer isn't just guessing about the olive oil lamps. These lamps were depicted in Egyptian reliefs, and there are even receipts for orders of their wicks and other such evidence. Another thing to consider is that, as far as tombs go, they weren't expected to be lit. In fact, if all went well, robbers would not be able to find a way in, and the tomb would never see the light of day ever again. That was the plan. And if it weren't for 19th century explorers and dynamite, that plan might have worked too. But when we're talking about temples, like at Dendera, the false dilemma of not enough oxygen simply doesn't work. The temple is much more open. The oxygen levels are plentiful. They obviously used fire to light it, if for no other reason than because of the hundreds of years of black soot on the ceiling. Okay, so the false dilemmas have been addressed, but we're still left to explain what this relief is depicting. Let's first hear what Ancient Aliens has to say about the mainstream interpretations of this relief.
Egyptologists' explanation of this, and they have to have some explanation. There's got to be one. It has to be pretty mundane. It can't be that it's an electrical device. Their explanation is that it is a lotus flower. And what appears to be a bulb around is the aroma of the lotus flower. And so it's just a very odd depiction of a flower.
That is a terrible representation of the mainstream view of this relief. It's Ancient Aliens using a straw man argument to make their argument look superior. This relief is not so mystical if you have a little understanding of Egyptian art and religious symbols. This is a variant depiction of the creation of the world in Egyptian mythology. The Egyptians believed that before anything else existed, there was a vast primordial sea of nothingness. They believed that the first thing to emerge from this sea was a lotus flower. This is probably because the lotus closes at night and sinks underwater. In the morning, it reemerges and blooms again. It was believed that the lotus flower then gave birth to the first god, who was often associated with the sun. This relief was done after the god Atum was merged with the sun god Ra, and thus became Atum-Re. Atum, the god who created everything else after this point, is actually represented by a snake. And yes, it is a snake in these reliefs, not light bulb filaments. You can actually see the eyes and other elements of a snake if you look closely. This is pretty standard Egyptian mythology, that the lotus flower came forth first, and then the first god Atum, who was represented by a snake. Well, what about this bubble surrounding it? I will quote an expert directly on this point. Quote, "Despite the variety of deities, the Egyptians conceived the origin of the world as singular. Only one god, Atum, was responsible for the emergence of the universe as a bubble of air in the vast, limitless, inert ocean and everlasting darkness of the undifferentiated primordial waters, none, that existed before creation. In other words, the universe came forth from the lotus in a bubble of air." The other elements of this picture back this interpretation up. The universal bubble is here being supported or raised up by the goddess Nun. Nun is the primordial waters, and technically it is she that raises up the lotus, Atum, and everything else. This pose of outstretched hands is one of the more common motifs for Nun, and she raises and supports the universe from nothingness. In some versions of this story, the sun god represented in these scenes is Khepri, who is represented as a scarab beetle. Atum and Khepri sort of traded off being aspects of Ra in Egyptian mythology. So in essence, in more common versions of this scene, you have Nun, the primordial waters, lifting up the solar barge of Ra for its first journey across the sky. And this explains why the exact same poses are seen in this creation scene at Dendera. They are also depicting Nun raising up the universe out of her waters. This idea is very, very common. You can see other images of Ra emerging from the primordial lotus as well. The idea that the ancient Egyptians used electricity is something that is not even hinted at anywhere in the Egyptian records. And if you believe Ancient Aliens, they were not just using electricity, but vacuum tubes, which requires high amounts of electricity as well as rarefied gases like argon. And if this was the case, we should expect to find some mention of this somewhere. But Ancient Aliens has an answer for why we do not.
But if the ancient Egyptians had used some kind of electric light to illuminate their passageways, why does the visual evidence exist only in the temple at Dendera?
In Egypt, you had different areas of specialty, and Dendera was the area where the knowledge of the light-giving source was kept. And this secret knowledge was kept by the high priests. And they're the only ones who were privy to this type of information, because Dendera was the special place where this specific knowledge was guarded and kept.
Right. Of course, there's nothing in any text or on any wall that would back up anything that he just said. He even makes up this phrase, keepers of the light-giving source or whatever, just to make it sound official. Again, it's interesting that the temple where the knowledge of this light was kept is the same one with the hundreds of years of soot on the ceiling. Maybe they were trying to save on their electric bill. In conclusion, all the reasons that Ancient Aliens says light bulbs existed in ancient Egypt, such as no soot in the tombs and not enough oxygen, are easily dismissed as false dilemmas, and the so-called light bulb pictures are easily explained using standard Egyptian symbolism.
All throughout the Middle Ages, there are some magnificent paintings. And in certain areas of the painting, there are what looks like to be UFOs. They're always floating up in the sky, usually above the Virgin Mary or above Jesus on the crucifix, or somewhere we have sceneries that depict what looks like UFOs.
Almost all supposed UFO and art cases come from medieval art, and there's a pretty good reason for that. Most people are not aware of the symbolism rules of Byzantine or medieval art, and so they're easy prey for ancient astronaut theories about it. This theory concerning Byzantine art could never work on someone who studies this type of art professionally. Let me show you why. First, let's take one that Ancient Aliens showed in the background a few times in that last clip. It's a very famous UFO and art painting, and it usually is presented using a very poor quality image, so you can't see the details very well. If you look closely, you can see these objects have distinct faces. They are actually representing the sun and the moon, and you would think that someone being honest about this would fill you in that they appear in almost every painting of a crucifixion done in the Byzantine style. The sun and the moon were consistently depicted with human characteristics. Sometimes they had just faces, other times they had full bodies. The concept of representing the sun and the moon with human characteristics was a carryover from the pagan artwork of Rome. The Roman Catholic Church simply continued the tradition of representing the sun and the moon with human characteristics in the artwork that it had commissioned. The sun and the moon are usually facing the cross, which is supposed to represent them being witnesses to the crucifixion. The sheer number of Byzantine crucifixion scenes where these objects are depicted in such a way that is obviously supposed to be the sun and the moon should be enough to put this one to rest for good. Ancient Aliens goes on for a while about the 14th century fresco at the Viskovsky Dekani Monastery in Kosovo. This one has been a big favorite of the ancient astronaut theorists since it first appeared in a French magazine called Sputnik in the 1960s. This crucifixion scene is just like all the others we have seen, except it has a more full-body representation of the sun and the moon. There are just as many examples of the sun and the moon being depicted in this way, with full bodies, in other Byzantine crucifixion scenes, including in other places in this same monastery. Ancient Aliens also shows this famous painting. Well, famous to ancient astronaut theorists anyway. This one is like all the others, in that once you know what you're looking at, you will see so many other examples of it in medieval art. This one is called Madonna with Child with the Infant St. John. And to start out, I want to draw your attention just below, to the right of the object, where you'll see a character holding his hand to his eyes and looking toward the sky. With him is a dog that is also looking towards the sky. The painting was supposed to be depicting this passage in the Bible. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, an angel of the Lord come upon them. And the glory of the Lord shone round about them. And they were sore afraid. And the angel said to them, Fear ye not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you was born this day in the city of David a Saviour, which is Christ the Lord. So the shepherds and the glory of the Lord shining round about them are all in the context of the announcement of Jesus' birth from the Gospel of Luke. What really demystifies this is to show other paintings from the era depicting the same scene. Slowly, you will see what the so-called UFO is supposed to be. First of all, you will notice that all of these paintings have the same shepherd, usually with a dog, and usually with their hands to their eyes. Usually, an angel comes out of the cloud lined with light. In older pictures, the cloud in the scene would have had golden rays. Sometimes an angel is coming out of a big tear in the sky. Other times, like this one of a similar style, only the tear in the sky is visible, not the angel. In almost an identical tondo, we see the shepherd looking toward a red-dressed angel, and in the center, above the Madonna's head, there is the same light-rayed cloud. Here is the same scene painted by the artist's brother-in-law, with a bright star appearing inside a cloud. On a hill to the right, the angel appears to the shepherds. Here is another shepherd scene. We see the angel and the luminous cloud. Sometimes the angels would be depicted in the cloud like this. So, the Madonna with child with the infant St. John can safely be identified with the announcement scene in the Gospel of Luke, and all the elements in the painting are well known by students of medieval art.
The most famous painting, that without any doubt in my mind, depicts a UFO with its laser beam. It was made by Crivelli in 1486. The Annunciation to Mary.
In medieval art, in the Annunciation, when Mary is told that she will have a child, but she will still be a virgin, and the angels tell her this, over Mary's head is a space capsule. But what's a UFO or a space capsule doing over Mary?
This isn't a space capsule. If you look closely, you will see that it is formed by a circle of clouds inside of which there are two circles of small angels. This is a very common way of representing God, visible in a huge number of paintings. Gustave Doré, in the middle of the 1800s, even resumed this pattern of the circles of angels in his illustration titled Dante's Paradise. The so-called laser beam is present in a lot of paintings of this scene, and is used to show the impregnation of Mary by the Holy Spirit, often represented by a dove, which is present in this painting as well if you look closely. But this laser beam loses its value for the ancient astronaut theorist the more one sees of other paintings of this biblical scene, because it becomes obvious that they weren't trying to depict a space capsule at all, but rather the circle of angels motif. The last one Ancient Aliens mentions is this one.
One very interesting painting is where Jesus sits up in the clouds with quote-unquote God, and they're holding on to the antenna of what looks like Sputnik. And theologians say what is depicted here is nothing else but the Earth. But why would Earth have two antennae sticking out of it? And why would it be round? Because the mainstream viewpoint at the time was that the Earth was flat.
This is similar to all the others we have looked at, in that there are lots of other pictures of this biblical scene that help to give us context. The scene usually contains the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, usually symbolized as a dove, and they're holding what is sometimes called the creation globe. The idea that they're trying to convey is the biblical concept that the creation of the world is attributed to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This creation globe becomes a very common symbol in medieval art, and the only reason Ancient Aliens says it can't represent a globe is that, according to them, people at that time in history thought the Earth was flat. Although this idea about people in the Middle Ages believing that the Earth was flat is widely believed nowadays, it's little better than an urban legend. If you type in the myth of the flat Earth into a search engine, you'll see that the truth is that almost every scientist since the ancient Greeks knew the Earth was spherical. Here are a few quotes about this. Historian Jeffrey Burton Russell says the flat Earth error flourished most between 1870 and 1920. He said, quote, "With extraordinarily few exceptions, no educated person in the history of Western civilization from the 3rd century BC onward believed that the Earth was flat." He continues, quote, "The myth that people in the Middle Ages thought that the Earth was flat appears to date from the 17th century as part of the campaign by Protestants against Catholic teaching, but it gained currency in the 19th century thanks to inaccurate histories such as John William Draper's History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, and Andrew Dixon White's History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. Atheists and agnostics championed the conflict thesis for their own purposes, but historical research gradually demonstrated that Draper and White had propagated more fantasy than fact in their efforts to prove that science and religion are locked in eternal conflict. One funny thing about this is that Tsoukalos, in another episode of Ancient Aliens, in order to suit his purposes there, admits the idea of a round earth was even in the Bible.
Moses actually describes Earth seen from outer space. The quote is, "Thereupon I saw the whole round of the earth, at once the depth of the earth and the vast altitudes of the heavens." I mean, here he describes Earth as being round.
So there is no problem whatsoever with the medieval artists knowing that the earth was round, and therefore there is no reason to say that these symbols aren't representing exactly what the artists have always said that they represent. Almost all UFO and art theories come from the Middle Ages, and they all fail when they are compared with other paintings of the same scene, because one can then see that these were consistent motifs in that style of art, and were used to describe certain theological concepts, which, when explained in light of the concept that it's obviously trying to convey, it totally demystifies the objects in question.
Belize, Central America. In 1924, British adventurer Frederick Mitchell Hedges traveled here with his daughter Anna to explore the ruins of the ancient Mayan city of Lubantun. One afternoon, Anna climbed to the top of a crumbling pyramid, hoping to see the ocean.
It was high noon and she was at the top, and the way the sun came in, the way the rocks had moved on that, there was just a small opening and the light from the sun went through and it hit the top of the skull. And she ran down and she was all excited. She said, "There's someone in there with a flashlight."
Anna's father and others in their party were too large to fit inside the small opening of the pyramid. So they tied a rope around Anna and lowered her into the hole. When she came back up, Anna held the top of a strange crystal skull. A second search uncovered a matching jaw.
As you might have suspected, nothing you just heard is true. The real story about the Mitchell-Hedges skull is quite different. It's worth mentioning that the reason that Ancient Aliens focuses in on the Mitchell-Hedges skull is because all of the other known crystal skulls have now been proven to be fakes, and even Ancient Aliens admits this.
Scientific tests have determined that the two owned by the British Museum and the K. Branly were not authentic pre-Columbian artifacts.
The Mitchell-Hedges skull was the last hope for a real one, and the only reason it was the last hope was because the daughter of Mitchell-Hedges, while she was still alive, refused to have an official study done to see if it was fake or not. Rather than that, she toured around with it in New Age conventions and the like until she recently died. Her widower, however, in 2007, took it to the Smithsonian Museum for Natural History, where extensive testing was done on it. It was found to be a fake, just like the others. I'm not sure if Ancient Aliens produced this episode before or after 2007, but I suspect that they wouldn't have cared much either way. The real history of the Mitchell-Hedges skull starts with another crystal skull that was in the British Museum, which the forger of the Mitchell-Hedges skull copied it from. The British Museum acquired a crystal skull in 1898, at a time right after tools were first invented that made it possible to carve crystal skulls like these. We now know it was also a time when a lot of fake crystal artifacts were sold to museums. The British Museum skull, which has its own dubious history, was later found to be fake too, but in the 1930s it was still believed to be genuine, and it was proudly displayed in the museum. Based on research done on the Mitchell-Hedges skull by the Smithsonian Museum, it was concluded that the forger of the Mitchell-Hedges skull copied the one in the British Museum in order to make his work seem more authentic. The Mitchell-Hedges skull was first owned by a man named Sidney Burney, who we have records of trying to sell it to various people unsuccessfully for 10 years before this. He finally sold it to a member of the general public at a Sotheby's auction in London in 1943. That member of the general public was Frederick Mitchell-Hedges. We actually have the letter that Mitchell-Hedges wrote to his brother directly after purchasing the skull at the auction, in which he expresses his excitement about his new purchase. This will be important later. 5 years later, though, in a local paper, he was claiming that he found the skull himself in a daring expedition to Central America. Mitchell-Hedges was a renowned storyteller, and often sold his fanciful stories to Hearst newspapers. For example, Mitchell Hedges was a fisherman by trade, so he would have tales of him catching previously undiscovered animals, fighting off sea monsters, tales of man-eating sharks, as well as your average big fish stories. Later, though, with his book Danger is My Ally, he told tales of him discovering previously unknown lands and undiscovered people groups, as well as battling all kinds of jungle dangers. Later on, people would write editorials that had been to the areas that he said he went to, and publicly debunked him. Mitchell Hedges was also shown to hoax an odd situation involving a supposed robbery and several shrunken heads. He even lost a very public libel suit concerning this. But all of this only scratches the surface of the deceit that surrounds the Mitchell Hedges skull. First of all, none of the stories about the discovery of the Mitchell Hedges skull match each other, and all of them contradict the letter that he sent to his brother in 1943, which clearly says he bought it at an auction. It says, "The collection grows and grows and grows. You possibly saw in the papers that I acquired that amazing crystal skull that was formerly in the Sidney Burney collection. It is fashioned from a single block of transparent rock crystal, exactly life-size. Scientists put the date at pre-1800 BC, and they estimate it took 5 generations, passing from father to son to complete. It is anthropologically perfect in every detail, a superb piece of craftsmanship. There is only one other in the world known like it, which is in the British Museum, and it is acknowledged to be not so fine as this." Many years later, when this letter surfaced, his adopted daughter Anna tried to explain the discrepancy between these stories this way on her website. Quote, "In 1943, Mitchell Hedges got embroiled in another controversy that still rages in some quarters to this day. In times before burglar alarms, it was not unusual to leave valuable items with friends if one was going away for long periods of time. Mitchell Hedges did this with a school friend, Sidney Burney, who had always shown an interest in the crystal skull. However, in 1943, Burney inexplicably put the crystal skull up for auction at Sotheby's in London. Mitchell Hedges learned of this the day before and was so furious that for a while he was unable to speak. Unable to contact Burney, he arose the next day at 5 a.m. and traveled to London to retrieve his property. Sotheby's informed him that the vendor was Sidney Burney's son. When they refused to withdraw it from the sale, Mitchell Hedges realized the easiest way of regaining his property was to purchase it back. This he did for £400. This doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons, let alone that according to her story, which we will get to in a minute, this would mean that he had the skull for 10 years and didn't mention it to anyone, until after he writes this letter to his brother a decade later, obviously implying that it was something that he just acquired for the first time. After Mitchell Hedges died, the skull was left to Anna Mitchell Hedges, his adopted daughter, and this is when things get really sketchy. Anna spent her entire life trying to sell the skull. She hired a guy named Frank Dorland, an art dealer, to promote the skull so that she could get it sold. Dorland had worked with her father when he was alive to sell another one of his objects, which also turned out to be a fake. She and Dorland signed an agreement in July of 1964 that he would promote the skull and that the price of its sale must be no less than $50,000. Dorland then got busy trying to make everything look really official, including coming up with a totally different story for the skull's discovery. After this agreement with Dorland in 1964 was the first time that Anna claimed that it was she, not her father, who found the skull, something that no one else seemed to mention the last 30 years. By doing this, it made Anna the sole person who could establish provenience for the skull, something that a buyer would want, especially a museum. And because everyone else involved was dead by this time, there was no one left to contradict this new story. All of the mystical claims about the skull were born out of the 2 books that the promoter, Frank Dorland, commissioned in order to promote the skull. Here is a letter from Dorland to Anna concerning the writer who he wanted to write one of the books. Quote, "I have convinced Dick Garvin, who does sell, it is worth the percentage to you and me and you to furnish the information. This makes it a better book and makes more money all the way around. The skull is not sold. It is put to use in this manner and for public appearances to boost sales and interest." These books make outlandish claims about the crystal skull's origin and powers, and since the books were released at the height of the New Age movement, they enjoyed an uncritical and enthusiastic audience. During all these years, they tried desperately to sell the skull. The problem was that because of all the fakes, museums were now asking to validate the skull first. One letter from the British Museum to Anna shows that the negotiations were stopped when the curator caught wind of the actual history of the skull. None of this stops Ancient Aliens from promoting all kinds of contradictory stories about the skull.
Yes, they're alien artifacts. Even some people think they're made on another planet.
But they were created specifically to hold records from alien civilizations. There's a legend that there were 13 skulls, and that when the 13 skulls come together, then something significant will change in the world.
Legend suggests that there are 12 additional worlds out there, planets which are inhabited by intelligent species. These 13 crystal skulls that allegedly exist on planet Earth were each brought here from one of those 12 planets, and the 13th skull is the one that apparently contains all of the information of all those 12 different worlds.
And that's the legend of the crystal skulls.
But, as ancient astronaut theorists maintain, why would visiting aliens have given the crystal skull to the Maya?
The only problem is that no one can seem to find a record of this Mayan prophecy. The idea seems to trace back to one New Age author. Mayan scholars have never heard of this legend, and certainly not this one.
A lot of natives and a lot of people working with crystal skulls say that the high quartz content skulls, and especially the quartz skulls themselves, is the highest frequency or energy or vibration possible on the physical plane. And so a lot of native people kind of worshipped or took care of these objects because they knew that they had or felt that they had the highest energy possible on the earth plane.
This whole myth was birthed out of a marketing campaign for a forged artifact, a myth which found a home in the New Age. In conclusion, all of the proposed crystal skulls have now been conclusively proven to be hoaxes. The last holdout, the Mitchell-Hedges skull, was only still a candidate because it was not allowed to be examined until recently. Its history is full of greed and lies, and its genuineness could only be accepted by the most dedicated devotee given the facts we now know.